Have we been lied to about how Christianity began? In these programmes, we're exploring the secret Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible. In an earlier series, we looked at how many handwritten copies there are of the Gospels in the Bible. So how does the evidence for the secret Gospels compare with these?
When you think about either apocryphal works or pseudepigraphical works, non-canonical Gospels per se, the manuscript evidence for them is almost non-existent compared to the New Testament. Now, frankly, it depends whether they are Orthodox works or not. For example, the Epistle of Barnabas, which is considered Orthodox, we have several copies of that. Or the Shepherd of Hermas, which is Orthodox, we have several copies of that, several meaning in the dozens, I think. But then you look at the Gospel of Judas, we have one copy of that. The Gospel of Thomas, we have one copy in Coptic, 3 fragments in Greek, and perhaps this Jesus wife fragment that was discovered recently is based on the Gospel of Thomas. We're not exactly sure, but even so, it may well be a modern forgery that was based on Thomas to a printed text of the Gospel of Thomas that someone has been able to determine. You have almost no evidence for this stuff. We find out about these apocryphal works mostly from church fathers, and then we discover them later. The Gospel of Thomas wasn't discovered until 1945 in the Nag Hammadi codices. And so even though we hear about them, and when scholars find them, they jump all over and say, see, here's an alternative form of Christianity that existed and flourished. Well, if that really is the case, why don't we see a lot more copies of it than we do? And why don't we see any hints that it ever existed in the first century? They talk about the New Testament as being early, but they'll say orthodoxy is just the view that ultimately won. But it won because it finally persuaded most people that it was right. And it won by its might, not because it was true. And there is a view, Bart Ehrman holds to this, Walter Bauer before him held to it, that there are a variety of Christianities that were there in the beginning, and Orthodoxy is just one of those versions, but it's certainly not the one that is pristine or represent the teaching of Jesus. The problem is when you look at early Christianity, you have to distinguish between early Christianity and earliest Christianity. You look at the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Philip, Mary, all the rest of them, they're not first century documents. But the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all first century documents. So we have to ask the question, what did earliest Christianity look like? What did Christianity in the first century look like? And that's where we get our New Testament.
We also looked earlier at how the use of names in the Bible's Gospels shows reliable first-hand knowledge. How does the use of names in the secret Gospels compare with this?
When we compare the names and the geographical knowledge in the 4 Gospels with that shown in apocryphal Gospels, in non-canonical Gospels, we find a real contrast. We find that whereas the canonical Gospels know people's names, they know the geography of the land of Judea and Galilee and so on, we find a complete absence of that geographical knowledge in the non-canonical Gospels, and also no detailed knowledge of what people were called in the place in the land of Israel.
There are many more handwritten copies of the Bible's Gospels than there are of the secret Gospels. The Bible's Gospels are earlier than the secret Gospels, and they show first-hand knowledge of the people and places involved. The secret Gospels don't. Next time, in the last programme in this series, we'll look again at why some Gospels were included in the Bible but others weren't.